Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View. We have with us a very, very special guest, Sam Barron. Sam, thank you so much for joining the show. And
Thank you for having me.
just to give a brief intro of Sam, and then we'll be giving his detailed bio in the description of this YouTube podcast. So Sam focuses on the international politics and economics of the Asia Pacific, with a particular emphasis on Japan, Southeast Asia, and the intersection of trade and human rights issues across the region. Sam holds an MPhil in international relations with distinction from the University of Cambridge. We're going to talk about Japan, Asia Pacific, and also China. So, Sam, my first question is, no, there was on May 24th, the Financial Times London. So it did a very interesting story in which it was kind of a leak between about the developments which were happening in a high stakes Beijing summit between US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And it has been reported that Xi became highly vocal and agitated, specifically regarding Japan's remilitarization or rearmament. So, what exactly about Tokyo's current military trajectory is triggering this level of alarm in Beijing?
Thank you so much, Arun, and it's great to be here again on the podcast for a second time. It's a really sharp question, and it's caused quite a lot of discussions and controversy, particularly here in the US, but also across the region writ large. Um, The event that you're specifically referring to at the May summit when Trump came to Beijing, I'd read in I think several different reports from the Financial Times that in response to Xi's visible outburst about the Japanese security policy, that Trump had actually pushed back against Xi and said that the reason that Japan is doing this and the reason the Takaichi government is remilitarizing and increasing its defense spending, etc., is that it's worried about the threat from North Korea, even though in the official security documents that have been released by Japan, and Takaichi has been very explicit about that this is very much targeted towards the threat from the Chinese. And so the reason this is happening, I think it's important to kind of talk about the context a little bit. So right before this summit happened in Beijing between Xi and Trump, a few weeks earlier, there was an announcement from the Takaichi government that Japan would scrap some of its long-standing restrictions on defense exports and begin allowing, for the first time since the end of the war, certain weapons and defense procurement technology to be exported to 17 of Japan's closest allies and partners. Thus far, what most analysts have predicted, or what has been sent thus far, has been mostly to the Philippines and to other emerging kind of security partners in the region, mostly ASEAN countries, where there really is a strong need for modern military equipment and a diversification away, not just from U.S. procurement, which is where most of these governments and militaries get a lot of their weapons, but for another kind of regional player that has the capacity and the budget to really do this. But beyond the recent headline about kind of this new change in the policy of the Takaichi government, I think one interesting angle or important thing to note from a historical perspective is that before the U.S. entered into a security alliance with Japan and rewrote their constitution and occupied them at the end of World War II, Japan was the most significant military power in Asia. And even today, there's a lot of acrimony between the Japanese and the Chinese over the legacy of the war crimes that were committed in World War II of the Japanese military against Chinese citizens. And a lot of that kind of spooks back to kind of the historical memory of when Japan was a military power. um, the rape of Nanking, rapes of women, children, really gruesome, horrible things that happen during war. And so it still is very much lives on in the popular memory of people in China today, especially amongst the CCP and other communists related to Xi. But to go back to the original question, what you asked is, why does Xi care so much about why Japan is rearming? And I think there's kind of three primary factors that kind of tie into it. The first, which I think is pretty obvious to anyone who remotely follows current events or the news writ large, is Taiwan and the potential Taiwan contingency. So last year, Takaichi made some very incendiary remarks at the Japanese Diet, which is their version of a parliament, basically saying that any Chinese naval blockade or potential invasion of Taiwan would constitute a survival threatening situation. Phrasing, so under the Japanese 2015 security legislation basically invokes the right to collective self-defense. And basically, in layman's terms, what that means is that a sitting Japanese prime minister said in a very public forum that Japan would potentially fight alongside the US in the event of a Taiwan contingency. And of course, the Chinese retaliated very forcefully, and we saw a lot of that happen over the course of last year and early this year. But prior to this point, no Japanese leader had been that explicit about kind of the Taiwan question. Um, and then the second is, kind of what I mentioned at the outset about this recent change relating to Japan's defense export policy. And this is very, very important and concerning to Chinese military strategists and to Xi in particular, because Japan and the new partner countries aren't just developing and buying missiles and defense hardware for their own defense, but they're putting them on islands and in the first island chain that are kind of close to Taiwan and could be potentially leveraged against China in such an event. Um, the current Japanese defense minister, Koizumi, who actually lost the LDP leadership election to Takaichi last year, has confirmed in the media plans to deploy a new surface-to-air missile on Yonaguni, which is an island about 68 miles off of Taiwan's eastern coast. And so that in and of itself is very concerning to China that these weapons that Japan now did not historically produce since the end of the war are now being potentially used against them in an offensive manner is very concerning. And then lastly, to kind of dovetail on that point about old taboos now becoming basically new policies, is that the ongoing revision of these three security documents that I talked about at length in our last conversation has put kind of the nuclear question or questions about nuclear policy back on the table. So meaning that the principle of potentially an introduction of U.S. nuclear weapons into Japan, not a Japanese bomb, but for Beijing, this is very alarming because it, essentially increases the risk of a nuclear war in the region outside of the North Korean context. And then Takaichi's push for a constitutional amendment to essentially legitimize the self-defense forces, to expand their mandate. So it's not only just about self-defense, but that in certain contexts they can be deployed in an offensive manner. And so for these three reasons, I think Xi is very rightfully concerned about Japanese remilitarization and kind of the implications of a lot of these new policies that are being put out by the new administration.
So, Sam, you mentioned about the constitutional amendment which Japan is bringing. So, for decades, Japan adhered to a strict 1% GDP on defense spending norm, and
Yep.
now Tokyo is actively pushing that to 2% by 2027. So, there are two parts of this question. What concrete military capabilities is Japan trying to build up? And or what specific kind of basically capabilities it is going to buy with an increase in the budget? And does this officially mark, the end of its post World War II policy of pacifism?
Thanks, Arun. Both of those are great questions. To start off, I think the first thing to point out is that Japan has actually beat its own deadline with respect to increasing its defense budget relative to GDP. So right after Takaichi took office, she actually moved the 2% of GDP defense spending target up from fiscal year 2027 to fiscal year 2026. And so the supplementary budget, which was already passed, basically increased the level of defense spending to about 11 trillion yen, 70 billion US dollars. I don't know what the exact number would be in INR. But basically, Japan is now on track to become the world's third largest defense spender after the US and China, whereas for years that wasn't necessarily the case. In terms of kind of what the Japanese are using the new money that they've allocated for the defense spending on, um, this is fundamentally about kind of the strike capability that Japan has denied itself for 70 plus years since the end of the war, that is now being amended and changed. And so recently, just to list some examples of the things that Tokyo has purchased or plans to purchase through all this new money that's been allocated, is that they purchased 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles that are now operational on some Japanese vessels that can target or that can reach targets over a certain, I think, over 1,000 kilometers away. New Type 12 missiles that increase the range from a previous 200 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers. And so um, lots of new technologies are being both purchased and developed, some from the US, some from other partners like Australia. And another very interesting development that Japan has allocated money towards is that they've actually been giving pretty sizable grants to startups and early stage defense technology companies to create kind of or come up with innovative defense technologies around dual use, to partner with US startups to see kind of how both militaries can work together and use these potential, weapons in the actual Indo-Pacific theater versus them being exported to the Middle East or the Ukraine war, or wherever else the US is um, active in the world. But even with Japan doing all of this and Takaichi moving the ball forward, from 2027 of the 2% to now 2%, now officials in Washington, and in particular, someone that I had mentioned during the last conversation, Elbridge Colby, who is Trump's basically policy wonk at the Pentagon, has called Japan's 2% target, which is, unprecedented, given the history of what happened after the war, as a quote unquote manifestly inadequate. And what Washington, at least Washington under this administration, wants Japan to do is, the 2% that they've already floated isn't good enough. What they want is 3.5% spending of GDP, potentially 4% over a longer, 10-year period, which would essentially push Japan past $125 billion a year and really increase the amount of burden sharing that the Japanese would be taking on in terms of maintaining the current security alliance. To answer the latter part of your question about pacifism, so I think I would resist using the word death of pacifism. I think we're very clearly seeing a transformation of Japan into a more active security player in the region. But as it currently stands at the moment, I mean, Takaichi may try to amend it, but Article 9 of the Constitution has not been changed yet. Every new capability, including the defense exports, have been legally framed under the Japanese constitution as for purposes of self-defense. And Japan still has not, brought US nuclear weapons onto the mainland. And there's still pretty significant constraints around the use of force. And so while we're seeing a lot of these big changes kind of happen, um, and it's been unmistakable how fast they're kind of accelerating in this process. Um, the fact of the matter is that the core tenets of this quote unquote pacifism that has existed and has governed Japanese defense policy over the past 70 years is still in place. So the formal architecture is there and may be amended. We're seeing kind of headwinds in a certain direction, but particularly amongst Japanese people. And so a lot of these changes are being made by the Japanese government at the behest of the US or at the behest of the fact that they don't trust the US and want to diversify, and basically have a hedge in the event that the US doesn't come and do what they say they're going to do. But Japanese people, I still would say, um, very much identify with the pacifist label, even if what's happening, um, you know, all the changes that are being made don't necessarily point in that direction.
Sam, the news reports which are coming out in international press, so they at least show that there is palpable anxiety in Tokyo as Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump. So he has framed
Yeah.
Xi Jinping as a peer power, and he's seeking to stabilize the US-China ties. So is Japan worried that Washington might treat its security guarantees as transactional bargains rather than ironclad commitments?
Thanks, Arun. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the anxiety from the Japanese side about this is very real, and it's also grounded in recent experience rather than just pure speculation about some theoretical thing that may happen. So when Beijing launched its pressure campaign against Japan over Takaichi's Taiwan remarks, there was reporting that Tokyo had asked Washington for a public show of support, but the Trump administration, for a variety of different reasons, chose to stay quiet. Um, some reporting has suggested that it might have been to protect some of its trade negotiations with China that was at that time still ongoing, related to, you know, export controls on certain critical technologies, tariff rates, etc. Um, but then, and then of course we had the summit that we just mentioned back in May. And so for Japanese officials, the concern, particularly with this administration, but the anxiety goes back many decades before this into, Obama's first term, into the Bush era. It isn't any single episode, it's really a pattern. So the sense that Japanese security interests could be one variable or one bargaining chip among many in a broader negotiation that the U.S. has with Beijing. And so, and what makes this particularly, this moment in particular, delicate in Japan is that for the past 3, 4 years, ever since Abe had left office, um, Abe being Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese prime minister, who was quite consequential for a variety of reasons. But basically, Japan has spent the past 3 years basically bending over backwards trying to accommodate Washington. So they've doubled their defense spending. They moved the 2% target forward. They're attempting to acquire this long-range strike capability that would aid the U.S. and potential Taiwan contingency. They're taking a firmer line on China, even when that hasn't necessarily benefited them, absorbing diplomatic costs and with Beijing in the process. The Beijing banning exports of seafood, retaliation um, with respect to tourists, with respect to visas, many different aspects. But Japanese strategy essentially rests on the assumption that the American commitment is steady. So when Tokyo sees all these different events happening, tariffs applied to allies, including themselves, negotiations over how much they should pay for certain military bases of the US to be stationed on particular islands like Okinawa. Um, they view that, potentially as a transactional um, event, and they are very much concerned with kind of the direction the current administration is going and what that means for the future of their own security. That doesn't mean that, and to be clear, the institutional foundations of the U.S.-Japan security alliance are very deep and they're strong, particularly on intelligence sharing, co-production. But as your question very rightly pointed out, Japanese policymakers are very quietly questioning and kind of asking themselves and others whether the U.S. can really be trusted, and particularly this administration can be trusted, or whether they would have to continue down these, very transactional, um, continue with this very transactional approach towards dealing with the U.S. For the foreseeable future.
No, I just want to come to a little bit around Middle East, what we call West Asia in this part of the world. So,
Yeah,
we have seen the US redeploy critical military assets out of East Asia to Middle East during the current ongoing Iran war. So, how vulnerable does this US distraction leave Japan? And does Beijing view this layout as a window of opportunity around Taiwan?
thanks, Arun. And I'm really glad that you used the descriptor of distraction here because I'm in 100% agreement. And in my view, that's exactly what the war in Iran and the escalating crisis in the Middle East has actually been. There's a really interesting article that was recently published in Foreign Affairs magazine by a pretty senior American foreign policy strategist based at the American Enterprise Institute in DC. He's on the right, has historically um, advised Republican presidents and other thinkers in Washington. And the article, I think it's called Asia After America. And basically, the core argument is that the US has said since I believe it was 2011, that the US was going to pivot to Asia, and every single time something gets in the way. First, it was the first Ukraine war. Then it was under the Biden administration. It was Israel-Palestine. It was Afghanistan. It was and now it's in 2026. It's the Iran war started by Trump, and so basically he argues um, that Washington is perpetually pulled into other theaters. It can't basically get its head out of its ass and focus on Asia, where it really needs to be a leader. Um, and so strategically for Japan, this means I guess the cost of this, the fact that the US has not been successfully able to complete this pivot is twofold. So strategically, as you were alluding to in your question, the resources and attention that underwrite deterrence and security architecture in the Indo-Pacific are being siphoned into this war in Iran right now, at precisely the moment that Tokyo and Seoul and other Asian capitals have bet everything on a sustained American presence in Asia. But the second cost of this distraction in the Middle East is a bit more immediate, and it's hitting every Japanese household, it's hitting every Japanese factory, and that is energy. And so Japan is one of the most exposed countries in the region when it comes to the importation of its energy needs. It imports about 85 to 90% of all its energy. And before the war, more than 90% of Japan's crude came from the Middle East, and all of that energy, or nearly all of it, transited through the Strait of Hormuz. And so when the war disrupted that channel, Tokyo essentially with no warning from the US that this was even happening, despite the fact that they're supposedly allies, had to release strategic reserves of energy just to stabilize prices for a set number of time, and also scramble to try to diversify and obtain um, the energy that they need from other sources, including shale and natural gas from the US, oil from Central Asia, like Venezuela and Latin America. And so the shock of the war and the distraction in the Middle East, beyond the strategic implications we already talked about, um, have had a huge impact on Japan and Tokyo in particular. And so the irony of it is very sharp in that Japan is counting on the US, at least theoretically, to deter China, to help them prevent and the outbreak of a new conflict. But simultaneously, this new war in the Middle East and how the U.S. is so preoccupied in the region has basically weakened that prospect of deterrence and also raised the costs for everyday Japanese citizens. And I think that's, been broadly the case across most of the rest of the region as well. I know India, for example, has had many, many issues related to energy security around the outbreak of the war.
Sam, as you know, a significant portion of your research focuses on Southeast Asia. So I want you to share your perspective on this particular issue that as Tokyo realizes it cannot rely 100% on Washington's undivided attention, as we have just discussed, how is Japan using its economic and defense industrial ties with ASEAN nations to build an independent security counterweight against China?
So Japan has always been a pretty significant player in Southeast Asia, economically, diplomatically, and increasingly on security. But what's really changed recently is the intentionality behind a lot of this engagement. So as Tokyo realizes it can't count on Washington's undivided attention, it's been, as you noted in the question, been quietly building these foundations for a more independent hedge security counterweight to China. And so you can see this in a few concrete moves that Japan has taken recently. So a couple of years ago, Japan launched the OSA, or Official Security Assistance Program, which is essentially a new form of development aid that's modeled on helping to provide assistance in weapons and other defense procurement assistance to regional militaries rather than individual government ministries or people like building infrastructure. And the vast majority of this aid through the OSA program has been targeted overwhelmingly at Southeast Asian countries. So, and around the same time as this OSA program has been released, Tokyo unveiled what is called a co-creation vision with the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, of laying out the ways that Japan wants to engage countries in the region across the board on issues like infrastructure and development finance, supply chain resilience, technology, critical and emerging technologies, building out the defense industrial base, and providing and making sure that Southeast Asian states have the necessary equipment that they need to actually deter China. And so one of the most visible pieces of this recent diplomacy and kind of the efforts of this Japanese engagement has been in maritime security. So Japan has been training regional navies and coast guards, transferring patrol vessels and other satellite and radar equipment, and building the capacity of frontline states in the South China Sea, like the Philippines and Vietnam, not only to monitor, but also to push back on Chinese pressure that is exerted within the exclusive economic zones of their own waters. And so I want to be clear about kind of what Japan is doing and what it isn't. And so this counterweight to China isn't necessarily a break from its security alignment with the US and the US-Japan alliance. But everything that Japan is doing in Southeast Asia is still aligned with and reinforces the alliance architecture. So I think it's best understood um, as kind of a hedging maneuver. And not to beat a dead horse, but given the questions that we've already discussed on this episode about American reliability and the staying power of the US in the region, Tokyo is making sure that if Washington's attention continues to wane, continues to be focused on other theaters, their eye isn't necessarily on the ball, that Japan and its partners are still working with all these different regional militaries and regional partners, and that they're not left without options in the event that, something that the US doesn't step up to the plate. And so the reason Japan can pull this off, as opposed to, why the US or China can't as easily do the same thing, is that it's one of the rare partners for ASEAN states that's credible on both the security and economic fronts. So the US historically, I mean, at least prior to this administration, has been kind of a lousy partner, particularly on economic issues and on trade. Whereas China has been a very lousy security partner because of encroachments in South China Sea, other maritime disputes. But Japan, there's been no problems. Japan is a middle power, has no vested stake, and it delivers on both of these kind of key areas of engagement. And it's that kind of dual credibility that makes the country a viable counterweight in its own right. And it really distinguishes it, I would say, even from countries like Australia and India.
Tim, I want to talk a little bit about, Indo-Pacific and especially the
Yeah.
India-Japan ties also. As China is asserting itself and putting a lot of maritime pressure in the South China Sea. So how do you see India and Japan coming together to leverage their mutual economic cooperation and also naval presence to secure these crucial trade corridors?
So the India-Japan partnership works best when you understand it as a division of labor rather than a joint fleet. So Japan, alongside the US and the Philippines, is increasingly active at the eastern end of the corridor, or the Indo-Pacific, as you would say, the South China Sea and the first island chain, while India anchors the western end of those waters. So the Indian Ocean and it approaches to the Malacca Strait, through which most of China's own energy imports pass through. And so neither country, Japan or India, patrols the other's waters or theater, but together they kind of ensure that these sea lanes that carry over 60% of global maritime trade are watched and appropriately defended along their entire course of travel. And so the connective tissue between the two, joint exercises between Japan and India have grown genuinely sophisticated, between sharing of logistics agreements, a quad-wide surveillance network that fuses satellite and patrol data across the various different waters from Oman into the East China Sea. And the economic dimension outside of the trade elements I just talked about is just strategic. And so Japan has committed roughly 68 billion dollars of investment into India, and that spans across a wide variety of sectors, including semicon, critical minerals, defense tech, and production. And it's designed to build supply chains that are harder for China to coerce or have an influence over. And so by partnering with each other, kind of both of these countries are reducing their exposure to China, and also the kind of export restrictions that Beijing has used as a kind of a cudgel or as leverage previously. The caveat is that this kind of arrangement between Japan and India is by accumulation and not necessarily a formal alliance. So India guards its strategic autonomy very carefully, and won't sign anything that it deems as unfavorable to its interests. But that's also um, part of the utility as well. And so the goal isn't to necessarily blockade anything or enter into a military alliance that would prevent the Chinese from doing something. It's to kind of raise the cost of any attempt to close these waters or to close these trade corridors so that China can plan against a set of capable economies and navies rather than ones that are in isolation or not necessarily talking to each other.
So, my last question is that if we look down the line over the next 24 to 36 months, what is the single biggest blind spot or wild card that could completely disrupt the US-Japan alliance? Or put it in other words, what should our viewers be keeping their eyes on?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the durability of the US-Japan alliance over the short to medium term, the 24 to 36 month window that you've kind of outlined, everyone right now is rightfully worried about the Taiwan contingency, the immediate impacts and longer term impacts, frankly, of the Middle East conflict going on in Iran, and also about the dependence of the US with an increasingly inward looking and unpredictable foreign policy posture that leaves a lot of our US allies and partners kind of guessing what they'll do. But what I think has really been overlooked, specifically in the Japanese context, and what could really blow up the alliance is that, and what analysts and lay people like should be following, and your listeners particularly, is the money. And what I mean by the money is that Japan, through all these different policy changes and in trying to appease the US to increase defense spending, has promised essentially the biggest military buildup in its post-war history, while also carrying a 236% debt to GDP ratio. And so if you actually look at it in relative terms, Japan has a larger debt and pure percentage numbers than the United States does. And that bill is coming due in a relatively short amount of time. And so the Japanese 30-year bond yields have just hit record highs, and now debt servicing is eating up to a quarter of the Japanese national budget, which is almost 3 times of what Japan currently spends on defense. So the funding plan for a lot of this defense buildup has always been shaky, and how they funded a lot of it, at least thus far, under the Takaichi administration and then Ishiba and Kishida prior to that, was a mix of taxes on tobacco, on companies, on income taxes, um, some of which have been delayed and some of which have been adopted, but in a more fragile political coalition. So, let's say there's elections that are held in 2 years or 4 years, and the LDP majority is not as strong, and Takaichi is not as commanding of a figure as she is right now. These high, this amount of defense spending may not be sustainable in the long term, and that could cause a rupture, particularly if, a JD Vance or Marco Rubio or another figure on the right is elected in the US and wants to maintain this very aggressive level of defense spending. That could be a major issue for the alliance to deal with, because the US is already paying the lion's share of costs on the security front. But if Japan can't domestically pony up the money it needs to actually make enact these commitments that it's made in practice, the U.S. could take umbrage with that, and it could cause a series of different issues down the line.
Thank you so much, Sam, for decoding all these issues and taking so much of time out from your busy schedule. And thank you, viewers, for watching. We hope to host you back soon again, Sam. And thank you once again for joining the show and decoding all these complex issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.